Hello and welcome back to Perspectives. On today's show, we look at India's increasingly cosy relationship with China. Should we be concerned as the nation gains more access to US intelligence? In Canada, a major retailer is hit with massive fines for mistreatment of its foreign workers. And as an Indian is arrested in California and suddenly appears wearing a poorly worn turban to pretend to be a Sikh, we look at this growing tactic of India's criminals when arrested to deliberately smear the reputation of the Sikh community. And in the UK, more MPs begin to rally around the community as the government becomes increasingly under pressure to secure the freedom of Jaggi and launch its long-promised 1984 inquiry. All this and more on today's show. But joining me as always for Perspectives is our very own correspondent in Canada, James Cousineau. Good morning, James.
Good morning, Angus, and good morning to our viewers out there. Don't forget that we have been looking for some historic or just some memorable photos that you may have collected. We're looking for things like human rights, people doing things that they do throughout the day, and of course we would love to see some that accompany stories of historical events within the Sikh community and share those with our viewers. So make sure that you email those in. Stay tuned to the end of the show and Angus will provide you with the email address. Other than that, folks, thanks for all your comments and your likes and your shares. And remember, we always are excited to get new viewers, so share the links with all your friends and family. Back to you, Angus.
Absolutely right. And today, as always, James and I will be bringing you our perspectives on the daily news affecting the Sikh community across the world. And yes, indeed, as usual, we'll take a look at loads of your great comments at the end of the show, so stay tuned for that. Right, James, let's get underway. What are you going to start us off with this morning?
One of Canada's largest retailers in the petrochemicals and the fuel industry has just been levied a massive fine of $164,000 Canadian. This is because of the way that they are treating their employees, and more specifically, their foreign employees who are here under the temporary worker program. Now, this gas station is located northeast of Edmonton, Alberta, and it is a very, I don't want to say ugly community. I would just say it's not my type of community. It is very isolated and cold during the winter, but if you're an outdoor lover, snowmobiling, that's great. But the reason I bring that up is because when you bring in foreign workers, there really is not a big community for them to connect with, and therefore they're more isolated. As the foreign workers are isolated from fellow community members and the community as a whole, of course that leaves them open to more abuses. Excuse me. So right now, this station, it is a massive fine. It is rare that these type of numbers are calculated. So it shows the severity and the seriousness of this infraction. And they were actually hit with 5 different violations, and that included poor record keeping, failure to provide requested documents, underpaying workers, and not ensuring a workplace free from abuse. And that is, that could have been physical abuse, sexual, psychological, financial, or retaliatory. And that, of course, is a big concern that a lot of foreign workers, they are scared to speak out because of that, because of retaliation or potential retaliation by the employer. They could be facing threats of being fired and sent back to India, China, or wherever else they may be coming from. But they could also be threatened with wage garnishments, so deductions from payroll, and they're already being paid at a minimum rate. Now, people may look at it and say, hey, they're making $18 or $20 an hour. But let's face it, it is an expensive place to live. And, that is really not as much as some people in other countries may perceive it to be. But they work hard. They bring the labor that is much needed to these communities and to the big cities, labor that we cannot fill these positions with locally or domestically. With that said, it is a very big concern of a lot of people here that there are many employers that are getting under the radar when it comes to enforcement. Now, back to 2017, there were not a lot of checks in person to screen or to keep up with these employers. There were not a lot of checks to go in and talk to the employees and make sure that they were not falling to abuse. This changed around 2018, 2019, and has increased ever since. And it's very, as I said, very rare that you see that type of money when it comes to being fined. But at the same time, there was another fine that was levied to a trucking company out of Winnipeg, Manitoba. And they were, let's see, that was 2023, that they were fined $258,000. So it shows that the Canadian government and the government of Alberta are taking this problem seriously. And as we know, the number of visas, whether it's for temporary workers, whether it's for vacationing, or for students, has been reduced. And therefore, that also reduces the labor pool and the ability. So we have to make sure that we keep a balance, because as less people are able to enter the country under the foreign worker program, of course, that makes those positions more valuable to the workers coming in. And therefore, they could feel more pressure to not speak out when it comes to workplace abuses, Angus.
Yeah, this is it's quite a sad story in many ways, actually, because it does reflect a bit of an issue for India particularly. India exports an enormous number of workers, foreign workers, to all sorts of nations across the world. And it really is almost a lottery how those foreign workers end up living. If they go to the Middle East, for example, we've talked in the past about the conditions for Indian workers in the UAE and the Middle Eastern nations, and their conditions are terrible. They operate in 40 plus, 50 plus degree heat. They're regularly injured and worse, and yet their lives are just utter misery. But they keep on doing it because they need to make the money to send back home to India. So they are a particularly vulnerable part of society, and even Narendra Modi has raised their plight when he's met various leaders of various nations to try and discuss the conditions of his own nation's workers, and to varying levels of success. But what is encouraging and what is the good, or let's call it the silver lining of this story, is at least in many or most Western nations, if not all Western nations, certainly Western modern democracies, we tend to treat our foreign workers with a huge degree of respect, and the health and safety regulations are almost overly protective in many cases. So, and I think this story does reflect a very key element of Western democratic society, is that we do tend to take care of our workers, wherever they come from. And if they are illegal workers, of course, we all have illegal workers in our nations. Even bizarrely, they are protected, even though they are even recognised as illegal immigrants and illegal workers. Their rights are still protected. They can still be breaking the law by being in the country in the first place, but their lives and their very safety and health is legally protected, no matter what their immigrant status. And I think this story basically reflects that, and it is encouraging to see that. But it also does bring out that slightly, as I say, this slight sad tinge, this poignant tinge, in that it is so difficult, and you referred to this in Alberta, and of course Alberta, from what I understand of Alberta, does contain a huge region of very rural areas that are, well, as you say, contain communities that are very close-knit. They're very tight-knit communities, very cliquey communities, as we call it. And if you're an Indian worker ending up in some of these far-flung rural places looking for a job, you end up working. I mean, how hard it must be to build a life. We often talk about how the Sikh community, no matter where they've ended up, have always managed to make a success, generally speaking, of their lives. They've built lives from absolutely nothing and created wonderful businesses. They've created whole communities around themselves. But of course, many of these Indian workers arrive in these places, these far-flung rural places, alone, not knowing anybody, and treated like dirt, basically, in many cases. Maybe not so much in Canada, but certainly in other countries. And it is very hard. You have to feel, your heart goes out to these people trying to basically build a living, because they can't do that in India. India has become, and again, this is another story we've touched on, James, the poverty in India, this wealth gap is growing massively. So many workers in India below the poverty line are being forced to flee India just to look for any way to make a living, just to try and stay alive, to feed their families, to put food on their table. And thus, almost by definition, they are the most vulnerable people who are transiting around the world just looking for work to send money back to feed their families, Jen. So again, it does point to a rather sad tale to this story.
Absolutely. And I mean, we can look at so many different industries and so many different employers. And one that pops out to my mind, Angus, is the family that owns the Vancouver Canucks, the NHL hockey team. Now, they also own farms in Metro Vancouver, throughout British Columbia, and many other, property development companies and so forth. Now, this is a family that has on their payroll, they have NHL stars who are making tens of millions of dollars a year. And yet, in some of their farm practices, they've actually been hit with fines and penalties because they don't even make sure that the vehicles transporting foreign workers meet the basic safety standards in the province of British Columbia. So it shows like they are exploiting these workers and their safety at the expense, while they're paying themselves, just ridiculous amounts of money, but they also have, NHL stars and celebrities that they are connected with. So they want to keep the attention elsewhere. But again, it just shows the disparity in which some of these employers, it's not just the little employers that are screwing the foreign workers. It is big corporations as well. And this, Petro-Canada is one of the biggest retailers in Canada when it comes to gas stations and service centers, convenience stores. And so it is just a shame that they are treating employees that make a lot of sacrifice. They've left their families behind in India. They've come to Canada with a dream to try and not only make a better life and future for themselves and their children, but to support family members that are still back in India, just trying to get by in some conditions that, here in the Western world, we couldn't even fathom some of the conditions in which people reside in. So again, it's just a shame that companies and employers are taking advantage of these people. So again, if you are a foreign worker in Canada, in the US, in the UK, and you feel that your rights are being violated, speak up, because there are protections for you if you do speak up, and they can go after the employer if they retaliate against you for holding them accountable to provide you with the basics and to be safe and to get the money that you've earned. So again, if you have issues, by all means, speak out. We are following this, and we try to educate as well, Angus, to try to cut down on this that's happening throughout, the Western world. Now, as we take a look at the Western world, we're going to shift away from this one, and we're going to take a look at India, China, and the US and what's happening there. It has been historically for the last several decades that India and China have been very adversarial. And this goes from border disputes right through to other issues around safety, the geopolitical issues that have come up. And of course, we know that the world is ever evolving, and that is one of the great things in the world, but it also brings with it a lot of challenges and a lot of concerns. Now, recently, India and China have been working towards improving their geopolitical climate and their relationship, and that is in all different areas of trade, of human rights, or so-called human rights as they want the world to see it, but not necessarily what's in practice. But again, they are claiming that there is some level of normalcy to the relationship being restored. And that, I think, helps to position themselves, both India and China, in a broader context to calm some tensions in the Asian region. However, with that said, we have to look at what's been going on, and that is the simple fact that China has warmed up to Pakistan. They are very involved with Russia, and those markets are very competitive. And, they, on the other hand, India and China are both trying to warm up with the United States. And even though there are a lot of tensions between the US and China, there are some things in the works to try and reduce that animosity between the two. Now, what really caught my eye, or what really brought me to concern, is the increased level and the announcements recently that the U.S. is going to increase intelligence sharing with India. And a part of that is because of the U.S. and the Western world's concerns about the stability and the aggression that may be taking place with China. So it raises concern about what information is going to be shared with India and Modi and, of course, his intelligence agencies, and what they may breach in terms of the confidentiality and share with Russia. This is a big concern when you look at Russia, China, and India, as well as Pakistan in that region. It is a big concern. But at the same time, they are trying to work together to break down some of the Islamic terrorist threats that hit the region. And they are looking, to expand on other areas in which they already cooperate. And that could be the BRICS program or finance abilities, as well as the Asian infrastructure, investment banks, and so forth. So it's a very diplomatic or a fine rope of diplomacy there, where they're trying to increase their cooperation between Modi and President Xi Jinping, and that is going to be a big thing to watch. Now, apparently the border disputes that have been happening for several years, since about 2019, 2020, have been calmed down. But at the same time, with China's expansion of, the roadways and infrastructure and so forth being so close to the India border, there are concerns still there, but they are trying to work through that. There are other areas in which, India wants to be a part of the big boys group, and that's, the UN Security Council having a permanent membership and so forth. But again, it is, where the two countries dispute that, and China wants to block India and so forth. So again, it is a big concern, though, in the way that India is playing all sides of the fence. They are increasing the intelligence gathering as well as the sharing of intelligence with the U.S. and the Western nations, while also cozying up and getting warmer with China, with Russia, and other individual countries that the U.S. and the Western nations see as threats to democracy, to peace and stability within that region and elsewhere, Angus.
Yes, the geopolitics where India is concerned are extremely complex. India, well, as we often say, the West is desperately keen to bring India alongside, to align it more closely with Western democracies, because of course the big bogeyman, as we call it, is China. Traditionally it's been Russia, but the real threat to the Western world over the coming decades is no doubt China. So of course there's been this massive move recently to try and bring India a little bit more aligned with the West. Now, of course, it's not clear, it's not black and white. India has played a very clever game. You can't blame India for this, but India has basically done whatever is in India's best interest. And it picks its sides on different topics. It doesn't take one overall black and white binary stance. We are a Western democracy, or we are pro-Russia or pro-China. They are, well, on this topic, we're pro-West. On this issue, we're pro-Russia. They just pick and choose what works best for India. You can't blame them for that. But the trouble is, you fast forward, and this is really the way the strategists have to look at this. If you fast forward to a time in the future, and God forbid, the chips go down, as we say, let's say there is a war. What happens if China invades Taiwan? That is likely sometime in the future. That, unfortunately, is an event that has already been identified that could trigger a potential World War III. So let's fast forward to that, that time, God forbid it ever arrives. China invades Taiwan. The US gets all belligerent, say, right, no, that is against everything we stand for. It's war, basically. And the West go to war. Of course, the Western allies will form an alliance against China. The big question there is, what does India do? Now, India is traditionally aligned, also historically aligned with Russia. India has this enormously powerful relationship with Moscow that goes all the way back, certainly to at least 1947. And the KGB, as was then, managed to get its claws deeply embedded into the Indian ruling elite, the Indian government, as it manifests itself. So Russia is involved there as well. And traditionally, as I said, Russia's been painted as a bit of a bogeyman. Russia is weaker than it was. It's still a very powerful nation, but it is not as big a threat as China is, and Russia has since been weakened by the Ukraine war as well. So Russia sort of almost sits to one shoulder of China. So the big question is, what does India do? And this really is what I think the strategists are concerned about. India occupies a hugely strategic location in the Indian Ocean. If the West is to ever go to war with China, it needs control of the Indian Ocean. It needs access to go all the way around, to the eastern seaboard of China, etc., etc. It needs at least some protection and control over the Indian Ocean. If India aligns with China, that basically rules out the whole of the Indian Ocean, because India, of course, dominates the Indian Ocean. So strategically, if India aligns with China, that is a massive, massive threat to the West. Unfortunately, as I say, India at the moment it can afford to play both sides against each other. It can afford to pick and choose on various issues. But if it comes, God forbid, to World War III, it will have to pick a side. It will likely have to pick a side. And that's really what it comes down to. Which side will India fall on? Will it align with China? And if it does, that is a very, very scary prospect. If it doesn't, even if it aligns the West, that means the West can then use India as a springboard to attack China. And of course, India has those borders with China. Strategically, it's just absolutely enormous for the West to get India on side. So that's why it really matters. At the moment, it's all war gaming. It's all on paper war games. But this is what the strategists have to consider. And this is why India is so important. This is why the West is making these huge overtures. They're trying to align militarily. They're selling technology to India. They're now sending intelligence to India. Again, as you rightly say, James, a very dangerous game. But they've weighed the pros and cons. They know that a lot of this intelligence may well be traded with Moscow, because we do know the BJP and certainly the ruling elite of India want to go after the Khalistan movement. And we do know they are using the infrastructure of the FSB, the Russian intelligence agencies. They're using that infrastructure to target Khalistan campaigners. Now, Moscow may say, look, okay, if you want access to our infrastructure, our intelligence infrastructure, we want something in return. We'd like to take sight of what you've been passed by the US government. And of course, I have no doubt the US government will be fully aware of this potential. So what they will be sharing with India will be very carefully vetted. It will be shared on the belief it will likely be shared with Moscow as well. Will it be shared with Beijing? Probably less so, but you just never know. And this is unfortunately all the war gaming that the US and the West and the Five Eyes nations have to consider when trying to bring India on side. There is a balance. They have to do what they can to bring India on side, but at the end of the day, they do know that at any given moment, that relationship could suddenly break, could fracture catastrophically if India suddenly decides to take sides with China and Russia. Then who knows, James? Unfortunately, it is a war game that they have to go through probably on a regular basis.
Absolutely, Angus. And I mean, you look at the relationships, and geopolitical relationships are very touchy to start with. There's a lot of balancing. There's a lot of gamesmanship involved in it. And it can be challenging. You look at, India and Pakistan are constantly at each other and definitely not friends. So again, that is an issue because China is very cozy with Pakistan overall. And then you look at the relationship of India with places like Taiwan. And of course, that is at the ire of China. So again, it's about trying to delicately balance that geopolitical situation. But at the same time, what is the cost? What is down the road that is going to be shared between the two nations that maybe shouldn't be? What is going to stop them when as you said, they'd have to pick sides if it came to ever, hopefully it never does, but if it came to a World War III? And what is the capacity of their infrastructure in terms of technology and their ability to hack into systems? We know that individually, India and China both are involved in cyber attacks and other issues. But can you imagine those two major powers together could really cripple a lot of the world, Angus?
Absolutely, and just to talk about Russia very briefly as well. I don't align with this mainstream Western narrative about The Western press is full of this massive propaganda, this anti-Putin, anti-Russia propaganda. And if you believe that the mainstream narrative is that Russia is on the verge of invading Europe, we're on the verge of World War III. Putin has designs on invading Europe. And I'm sorry, I don't believe that. I think it's absolute nonsense. The Ukraine war, it's very clear what the Ukraine war is about. Putin's made that very clear. It's actually supported by the evidence and historic evidence what the Ukraine war is about. The Ukraine war is not about Putin's imperialism and his desire to take over the world. It's absolute nonsense. Now, Putin is a dangerous guy. He is a very powerful guy. Let's just say he doesn't share many of our same values. But at the end of the day, he does not have ambitions across Europe. He knows full well if he invades Europe, what's going to happen. It's going to be an enormous World War III, and we will win that. The bottom line is we'll win that. There's no doubt about it. He knows that. He's not stupid. And that's why he will not invade Europe. But the Ukraine thing is a very separate issue. I've talked a lot about that in the past, and so this is why I think we need to start taking, and of course you wonder why is the mainstream narrative to create this bogeyman of Russia. I think there is an agenda there for other reasons, maybe to unite the West for other reasons, but ultimately the real danger going forward is China, and it's this alignment between India and China I think we need to watch. My gut feeling is India will probably more align closely with the West. I think the BJP government is, well, as I say, the Gandhi dynasty and the ruling Brahmin elite of India have historically been controlled and tied to Moscow, but that is a tiny minority of the Indian population. I think when it really comes down to, I think the majority of India, they will just boot out that sort of Moscow alignment from ruling India. I think they will, if the chips go down, they will align with the West. That's my gut feeling, James, anyway.
Yeah, and I agree. It's unlikely that Putin would want to hit Europe in terms of the fact that he knows that's a net zero game, that he's going to suffer major losses and not win. Whether or not he wants to take certain little chunks, then, that's a different story. But at the same time, he doesn't want a full-blown escalation to be fighting against Europe, to be fighting against America. He wants to, gain what he thinks is rightfully theirs, and that's just not the way it is. But
indeed, and I have to say, I have actually spent time working in Moscow and have had Russian friends at the time, and yeah, they're good people. I do like the Russians. They've had a terrible, terrible history over the many years. So, anyway, let's move on, James, and let's scale down massively from global geopolitics to let's get down to the sunny California. And a story has emerged, which is quite concerning, actually, and it's a bit of a growing trend that seems to be appearing and hitting the certainly social media have picked up this story. It was reported recently that in Peel County in California, a gentleman from the Indian diaspora called Hitesh Bansal was arrested by Peel police after an extortion attempt. Now, Hitesh, in his mugshot, is seen wearing a turban. Now, when I say a turban, it's basically a piece of cloth that's just been really clumsily thrown together to make it look like a turban. And the Sikh community have spread around this photograph and said, what is this? This is a joke. This guy is not a Sikh. Clearly he's not a Sikh. He's never tied a turban in his life. But the story basically is this guy's been arrested and he's thrown on a turban. The question is why? And it's very clearly, and as the Sikh community locally have said, look, this is, it does seem that Hindus who are being arrested, and particularly Hindus who are aligned with this gangster, Lawrence Bishnoi. We talked about the Bishnoi gang a lot in the past. Of course, this Lawrence Bishnoi is currently in jail in India. I think he's in Gujarat, but he obviously has this very powerful reach, and he has a representation, let's call it, in California, where his gang are involved in exploitation and all sorts of extortion. And of course, many of them are arrested on a regular basis. But now it appears, and certainly this guy has been arrested, charged with extortion, and he's seen wearing a turban. And as the Sikh community have actually highlighted, this does seem to be a bit of a growing trend. And Baz News picked up on this as well. They said, for example, recently, Raj Kumar Mehmi, Dhananjay, and this guy Hitesh Bansal are all examples of a growing trend where non-Sikhs, such as Hindus, who've been arrested for crimes, don a Sikh-style turban exclusively for their mugshots. And of course, the belief here in the community is that these guys are doing this deliberately to try and smear the reputation of the Sikh community. Because of course, these mugshots are spread out. The police publicised. They put these on their social media accounts. They put them out in the public domain. They're seen on mainstream news. This guy was arrested, and he's seen wearing a turban. And of course, the impression it gives to the audience is, oh, it's just another Sikh. Another Sikh's been arrested. This community must be full of criminals. That's really what the belief is all about. Now, whether it's true or not, we don't know. But this is happening on an increasingly regular basis, and it's a little bit more than coincidence now. And it does point to maybe there is this, but you've also got to look in the context of what India and the Hindu RSS extremists, the Hindutva extremists, their whole trend line is to try and smear the overall reputation of the Sikh community. And this sits in the context of that, so it suddenly starts becoming believable. It seems ridiculous on the face of it, but you start joining the dots, and once again, those dots do start to paint a picture. And yes, it does align very closely with this general trend to try and smear at every opportunity the Sikh community. And of course, now the general public are seeing an increasingly large number of apparent Sikhs breaking the law. And then it's tarnishing the community's reputation in California and, of course, across the United States. It is very worrying. Now, interestingly, I did, as I looked at this story, somebody on social media, and of course social media, there's the usual bear pit of Hindutva accounts wading in, saying this is absolute nonsense, and it gets ruder than that, and I won't repeat many of the posts that were posted up. Hindutva, of course, all over this story. Every time the Sikh community raises issues like this, raises awareness of Hindutva's tactics and the RSS's tactics, then of course the Hindutva mob are all over it, trying to quash it, bury it. They're throwing huge amounts of misinformation, disinformation, fake news to try and hide the fact that yes, they probably are behind this. Now, amongst that bear pit of Hindutva bile, somebody posted up a really interesting excerpt from a book. This, I assume, somebody from the Sikh community. It was anonymous. But they posted up an excerpt from a book that was written a number of years ago by a guy called Inderjit Singh Jaiji. And the book was titled The Politics of Genocide. And it particularly examines what happened in the Punjab between 1984, of course, Operation Blue Star, and 1998. This was the time when the Sikh community were fighting literally for their lives against the onslaught of the India law enforcement, the army, and particularly the police. The Punjab police were brutal. They were ruthless. This literally is where, effectively, it was a genocide. They took a whole generation of young Sikhs out of the countryside and they murdered them in cold blood and then dressed it up as extrajudicial killings. They dressed up these extrajudicial killings as what they call fake encounters. They said, oh, he was a terrorist, they were firing at me, so we shot and killed him. Basically, they just took these guys out into the countryside after torturing them and murdered them in cold blood. So it was that period that this book examined in detail. But of course, the Indian government, and let me immediately refer you to the Chiting Singh Pura massacre that we talked about recently, where it appears on the face of it, where 35 Sikhs again were murdered in cold blood by apparent Islamic militants. No, it wasn't. It turns out it was probably the Indian Army, because it appears a whistleblower from the Indian Army has admitted that he was involved in murdering 35 Sikhs, but they dressed themselves up as Islamic militants to false flag it, to lay blame on another community, when in fact it was the Indian government behind that murder. Now, this book, this excerpt, goes back to the tactics that were seen in that period between 84 and 98. And I'm going to read you this excerpt. It's interesting. It gives an interesting insight, again, into these tactics of what the Indian government are prepared to do. And it says, this sort of violence cannot be sustained. This is a quote from what was called the butcher of Punjab, the head of the Punjab police, DGP Gill. He admitted, this sort of violence cannot be sustained unless a dominant section of the people believe in it. Such a strong movement was not possible without popular mass base. It continues to say, it was at this time that the Punjab police began to consider a counter-terrorism strategy using vigilantes in the garb of militants in order to muddy the waters. Again, I refer you back to the Chiting Singh Pura massacre and the whistleblower who's admitted this same tactic. So this is not nonsense. This is a tactic that they have used. These men were to pretend to seek refuge and support in a village. Those who helped them were revealed as strong supporters of militancy. Before leaving the village, they were to loot and perpetrate outrages which would turn the villagers against them personally and sow seeds of resentment against militancy in general. Ever since a little before Operation Blue Star, there were rumours about training of vigilante groups in camps on the periphery of Punjab in adjoining states. Trainees were said to maintain the Sikh form, in other words, pretend to look like Sikhs, and were made familiar with Sikh religion and culture so they could pass as Sikhs. Yes, here we go. It's more of these fake Sikhs, James, that we talk about. Later, such people were openly trained at the police training school Pilor and Badagoha Fort in Patiala as commandos. They all kept their beards and for practical purposes to pass as Sikhs. Some have been interviewed by the press correspondents of national newspapers. This is an act of deception on India's own people. In a large number of cases where villagers managed to arrest the miscreants, they turned out to be policemen in militant garb. This too has been widely reported in the press. So James, again, that book really highlights, again, this massive agenda of the Indian government against the Sikh community. They will literally sink to any level. And as this book highlights, has been supported by the whistleblower after the Chitting Singh Pura massacre, is that the Indian government is prepared to create fake Sikhs or fake militants, basically people pretending to be somebody else. They are agents of the Indian government, whether they are policemen, whether they are soldiers, or whether they're just criminals. They all dress up as somebody else to deliberately target the Sikh community, to turn the world against the Sikh community. And I refer back to what's happening recently in California, where these gang members, probably related to the Bishnoi gang, again we know they're proxies of the Indian government, they're criminal proxies of the Indian government. They dress themselves up as fake Sikhs, again to try and target and smear the Sikh community, James. It's a tactic that seems to have gone back all the way back to the 1980s, and it's still alive and well.
Absolutely, Angus. And I mean, if you look at the image on the screen there, and I mean, you can see how sloppy that turban is. And it just, as you said, it looks like, just a real makeshift, sloppy, quick thrown on there to try to give the impression that he's something he's not. To me, it looks almost like between that and his mustache, it almost looks like one of the Disney villains, that they trying to hide incognito. But that's how bad that looks. But at the same time, a lot of people in public are not focused in on that. They just see it at a quick glance in the news or, wherever. And they just assume that it's, that it is a Sikh individual being arrested and causing problems. And this is not isolated there. We've seen that in Canada recently, where some of the agents have gone into gurdwaras and really acted out and tried to disrupt activities and cause problems there. So it is an ongoing issue, and that is how they are trying to infiltrate different places, whether it is the gurdwaras, whether it's the mosques or elsewhere. They are trying to, again, impersonate these individuals or these communities to try and, again, give a negative light by the general public, but also to bring divisiveness within those communities, to bring separation, to push them apart, and to, again, question the trust that they have in each other. And that's what it's all about. They're trying to break down the trust in a community. Again, as you've called it before, the divide and conquers type of mentality, Angus.
Absolutely. And again, yeah, you're right. When you look at that photo, I mean, I certainly have to compliment that gentleman on an absolutely splendid moustache. It really is a magnificent moustache. But the rest of it, the turban, is just, it's risible. It's a very, very poor attempt. But unfortunately, the audience who see this, who aren't aware of the Sikh community and how, let's say what a real Sikh looks like, of course they're going to think, oh, it's just another Sikh criminal. Then this is the danger of misinformation like this. So it's a story to watch, that one, James. Okay, I'm going to move for my next story. I'm going to move back here to the UK, and we talked a lot about the political lobbying by the Sikh community, which has been really, really powerful, really effective. And I really do take my hat off to the Sikh Federation, certainly as one organisation particularly, who does really deserve a lot of credit for the enormous influence that they are now having on the British government and, of course, politics in general on behalf of the Sikh community. But, of course, the campaigners across the whole of the Sikh community have done such a great job, particularly in recent years, to raise the issue and the profile of the community and are now pushing, as I often say, pushing upwards from grassroots up into their political representatives in terms of, or in the form of their members of parliament. And this pressure from ground roots upwards through their local MPs is now starting to have an effect on the government. And the Sikh Federation have really been this wonderful rallying organisation to try and focus and filter and channel all this grassroots power up into where it really is going to hit home most, and how it can be channeled most effectively. And what they've said, and what the Sikh Federation have tried to do, particularly recently, is they've set up various petitions about various issues, but particularly about Jaggi, bringing Jaggi home. And of course, one of the key issues that really is ongoing is this issue of the 1984 Operation Blue Star inquiry. We do know, as we often report on, is that the British government had some form of involvement in Operation Blue Star, not directly but indirectly, in terms of the Thatcher government. The Conservative Thatcher government, Margaret Thatcher at the time, was consulted by the Indian government for what we don't know for sure, but we do know what has leaked out since is that the SAS were involved in providing consultation to the Indian Army on how to attack the Golden Temple, the Harmandir Sahib. But what we don't know is how deep that consultation went, how involved the British government was in Operation Blue Star, and what communications went on at that time between the Indian government and the British government. That is what needs to come out in the public domain. That is what Keir Starmer promised when he was in opposition. He promised to launch an inquiry, a government-led judicial inquiry into Operation Blue Star and the British involvement in that. He has not honoured that pledge. Of course, he's been in government now since July last year. We're still waiting for him to deliver, even announce, even mention an inquiry into Operation Blue Star. Is he betraying the Sikh community? Well, so far, yes. Come on, Mr. Starmer, where's your promise? Your promised inquiry. Well, so what the Sikh Federation have done in response to this is they said, OK, we're going to rally our troops, we're going to rally the community, and we're going to pressure our MPs directly, because in turn those MPs can then pressure both David Lammy, our Foreign Secretary, and Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister themselves. So again, they're channeling this power of grassroots into our local MPs, and the local MPs, particularly if they're government MPs, can then pressure their leader, because Keir Starmer is now increasingly receiving letters from his own MPs saying, where's this inquiry? What are you doing about Jaggi? And as I often say about politics, they will always take the path of least resistance. Leaders, particularly prime ministers, always take the path of least resistance. They always take the easiest path, the path that they find will win them more votes, let's say. So if the prime minister is under more pressure, eventually, and if these issues become such a pain in his proverbial, he's going to do something about it, and that's really the tactic here. So the Sikh Federation, under this petition, have said, look, any MP around the UK, if you get more than 100 signatures on that petition in your constituency, you have a moral obligation to write a letter to your leader, the Prime Minister, raising these issues. And that is what is happening. And now I believe there are 16 MPs who have now written letters to, or at least 16 MPs who have received over 100 signatures in their constituency and are now morally obliged to write those letters. And letters are going in. And there's been an excellent letter from the MP for Warwick and Leamington, that's in the sort of the Midlands to the west here in the UK. Matt Weston has written a really good letter to the government. And in fact, it's addressed to the Minister for Security at the Home Office. That's one of our main ministries. And what's particularly interesting about this letter, I mean, obviously we've talked about the main issues like Jaggi and the 1984 inquiry, but one issue that is raised a lot, and we've talked a lot about on this channel, is Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act 2000. What is that? Schedule 7 is a piece of legislation that is used by our border forces on a regular basis to, when a Sikh enters the UK, even if he's a British citizen, he can be detained for up to 24 hours by our police and interrogated. And this has happened on a regular basis. And I reported about Deepa Singh, who's the leader of Sikh Youth UK. He, a while ago, was detained under Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act. He got off a plane. He was taken off a plane by armed police. He was put into an interrogation room and spent the large part of 24 hours being interrogated about all sorts of things like, what's your relationship with India? What's your opinion on Jagtar Singh Johal? What do you think of India? I mean, why on earth do the British border police force have the right or even the interest in taking a member of the Sikh community who has not broken the law in any way, shape or form and be asked about his opinions on Jagtar Singh Johal or other opinions on anything like this? He had his devices taken from him. He was forced to release his passwords so they can access his phone, his tablet, etc., etc. This is what Schedule 7 has the ability to do. I asked Deepa, well, what happens if you said no? He said, believe me, you are under absolutely no illusion. You cannot say no to these people because you know that your life will be made very, very difficult if you refuse. In other words, Schedule 7 is dangerously powerful. It means it can be used malignantly against a member of the Sikh community like Deepa Singh was. So it is used on a regular basis against members of the Sikh community, particularly those campaigning on behalf of Khalistan, those campaigning on behalf of Jagtar Singh Johal. Because of course the British government, under pressure from India, because the British government want a trade deal, the British government are using and sadly abusing Schedule 7. So this MP has written about Schedule 7 specifically and said, look, this Schedule 7 is being used inappropriately. I am worried. In his words, I have a deep concern regarding the safety and security of British Sikh activists or Sikh activists. And he says the racial profiling and intimidation of Sikh activists under Schedule 7 is unacceptable. It's imperative that we prevent the discriminative use of this act, and we must stop it as it's currently targeting Sikh activists and ensure that they are treated fairly and respectfully. These measures were introduced by the last Conservative government and continue to be inappropriately used to harass Sikh activists. And he asked that we can take immediate action on these concerns. So well done to that MP. This has come as a result of direct lobbying from grassroots. So this is a message to all of you right across the diaspora, in the community. It really works. If you keep pressuring, you get as many people, even just around you, even just a few of you, you lobby your local political representatives because they in turn then feel this obligation, because they want your vote, don't forget, they have this obligation to then push that message up the political chain, and they start pressuring those who can really make a difference. And here is a prime example where grassroots pressure have pressured a local MP who's now written this enormously powerful letter to one of the ministers in the UK government, who now has to take this seriously. So again, James, this is why it really matters, and it is really powerful. Another letter has gone in, just as another example. Martin Rhodes, he's the Member of Parliament for Glasgow North up in Scotland. And he again has written, after pressure from grassroots, he's received all these letters from his constituencies, emails and letters, and he's written, because of course he's also been pressured by the Sikh Federation, but he said, and he's written to David Lammy, actually. This letter goes to David Lammy, he's the Foreign Secretary. And this MP has said, look, where is this inquiry into Operation Blue Star? Why is it being delayed? It appears the community, the Sikh community here in the UK, believes it's been delayed. Could you please answer our questions and answer the questions of my constituents? Where is this inquiry? Why is it being delayed? Because you set out measures where you were going to deal with this. He also talks about transnational oppression. Please could you outline what measures the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office is taking to address the alleged repression threat faced by Sikh activists in the UK, etc., etc. And Jaggy comes up as well. So James, there you go. This is a fantastic example of how everybody in the community can have an impact. You're not just one small voice. You combine all these voices, they have the power to mobilize members of parliaments, whether it's in Canada, whether it's in Congress or Senate in the US, wherever it happens to be, even in Australia or New Zealand. You have the power, your little voice, combine it with all your friends and colleagues. This can have an impact. It can change the direction and policies of government, James.
Absolutely, Angus. And I mean, let's face it, we've said it time and time again that justice delayed is justice denied. And it is long past the time due for people to have that sense of justice, that it has been investigated, that people are going to be held accountable, and at the very least, that history is going to reflect more accurately the atrocities that were committed against the Sikh community and the potential involvement of foreign nations outside of India. And we also need to understand is how that involvement potentially could have led to the even greater genocide of Operation Shanti. So again, it's so important that this be dealt with seriously, but it again reflects, as we say before, the pebble in the pond creates the waves, and they are far-reaching, and that's what really symbolizes the impact and the ability of grassroots organizations to make change in the world, Angus.
Absolutely right, and we will continue to add our small voice to the campaigns being pushed for the community. Right, James, the clock is marching on. We must rush through our comments now to move things along, and loads of great comments. Again, as always, my overall blanket thank you to our wonderful loyal audience who've been contributing so much in the comments. There have been some fascinating comments coming in. We're going to start off today with Human, who, of course, reflecting the wonderful weekend that was seen in California and Los Angeles. CALSA is US activism telling the world the United States is alive. Well, certainly the Sikh community's campaign is very much alive. The Khalistan movement is enormously powerful now. It is growing so much support. It is very, very much alive, James, just judging by the sea of wonderful yellow flags we see at every occasion.
Absolutely. Congratulations to everybody who took the opportunity to get out on the weekend to have their voices heard in the Khalistan referendum. And it looked to be a great turnout. And again, congratulations, everyone, for a great event.
Absolutely. And let me quickly refer back to what I've just been talking about. US activism takes many forms. It's not just things like the referendum. It is simply an email. It is a letter to your local member of parliament, your local senator, congressman, whatever it is. That is activism, and it all counts. It all matters. Hat B says, this is an interesting comment. Yes, India is trying to find out where the referendum votes are being stored. India will do anything to sabotage the referendum. There's a sober warning, James, that we do know India will literally sink to just about any tactic. If they're prepared to murder Khalistan campaigners, then certainly it is very likely they will do their absolute utmost to try and damage that referendum and the credibility of the referendum. And just to highlight the fact the referendum is being overseen by independent observers to ensure that it follows all normal democratic legal protocols to ensure the credibility of this referendum. I have no doubt that India will be doing their best with their dirty tactics to try and undermine the credibility of this referendum, James.
Absolutely, and that's something that I was just going to mention as well, that you hit right on there, Angus, and that was the third-party independent oversight. So that's essential to the credibility of the Khalistan referendum.
Absolutely. M. Verdi says, this is such a big topic. India is secular only on paper. Yes, absolutely. On the constitution, it is supposedly secular, but as we often talk about, and I even said last week or just the other day that Modi even campaigned in the last general election on a Hindu ticket, a pro-Hindu ticket, because of course the overwhelming majority of the population of India is Hindu. So of course he deliberately inserted religion into the whole political atmosphere, into the whole political campaign to try and unite the BJP vote, because we're all Hindus together. That's what it's all about. Whereas actually allegedly India is supposedly secular, and we're now seeing it increasingly so. This Hindu Rashtra, this agenda of the RSS, is trying to really push for an entirely Hindustan, let's call it, an entirely Hindu nation, to the expense and the detriment of all the minorities, whether it's the Islamic population, the Sikh community, whatever. Unfortunately, as you rightly say, Mbirdi, India is really, at the moment, politically speaking, definitely not a secular nation, James.
Absolutely, Angus, and it's a sad state that the animosity, the anger, but also the betrayal that goes on behind the scenes, and they hold themselves out to try to be, a secular society. But again, it is not, and it's a shame that people are behind the scenes working to contradict all aspects of life, whether it is political, religious, or otherwise.
Absolutely. And next comment from Amakara. This is an interesting comment. And I do have to thank TC as well, who got in touch with us about this. And this is a story I'm going to cover tomorrow, unless a bigger story comes in to bump it. But New Zealand's Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, was interviewed by Palki Sharma. And the queen of fake Godi media. She attempted to link Khalistan supporters in New Zealand with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But the look on her face to his response was pure comedy. And she did indeed question him repeatedly about New Zealand's opinion about Khalistan and trying to condemn the Khalistan movement. And as you say, Amakara, watching Godi media question Western democratic leaders has become pure entertainment. It's almost funny. Now, US Ambassador Eric Garcetti once explained they can only arrest people who break the law. And exactly, I saw an interview. In fact, I did a story, I think, about a year ago when Garcetti was interviewed by, again, the Godi media. And he said, look, no, we can only arrest Khalistan campaigners if they break the law. They're not breaking the law. So what can we do? We're a democratic nation. We follow the rule of law. It's black and white. Trump was asked about it. He ignored the question. Yeah, again, James, we covered that. That was hilarious. Tulsi Gabbard was supposedly asked, but apparently they never aired the footage. But nobody's prepared to align with India against the Khalistan movement, which is actually quite, as you say, Amakara, it's pure entertainment. It's true. And then later you came across a clip of Palki Sharma on a podcast where she got a little too comfortable and she admitted when she said, when you're in control of the story, you can set the narrative. Basically, she confessed to manipulating the media to vilify communities. Obviously, the Khalistan movement couldn't have been clearer. Yeah, thank you, Amakara, for this comment. And this, as I say, and thank you to TC for sending me the link. I was actually looking for that interview. There's a fascinating interview. Do watch tomorrow's show, and I'll cover this interview. It is absolutely hilarious, where the New Zealand Prime Minister is repeatedly questioned by this Palki Sharma about the Khalistan movement. And she got a verbal slap in the face, metaphorically speaking, saying, "Look, no, we're not playing your game." So anyway, let me cover that one, James. But ultimately, this really is, and I think this comment is absolutely right, is that the Indian Godi media are desperately trying to get Western leaders to condemn the Khalistan movement. Western leaders ain't gonna do it, James.
Absolutely. And we've seen that time and time again, that, we have something that we hold very dear, and that is our freedom of expression, our freedom of speech, and the fact that we can tell those who try to oppress others to go and pound sand, as we say politely, but we will stand up for our right to gather and have this democratic opportunity. So, and we're going to protect everybody else's rights to do the same.
Absolutely right. So yeah, do watch tomorrow. There's an awful lot to say and pick out of that interview. Some very interesting interpretations and interesting messages coming from that interview. So I'll cover that one tomorrow. Right. Azad Singh, yes, thank you so much for boldly exposing this Chicken Singpura massacre of Sikhs. It was an absolute, well, as you say, it's an absolute pleasure. That's the wrong thing to say. It wasn't a pleasure. It was just, that is our job. That is what we do. It is important that we highlight, bringing out the truth. It's an absolute outrage what happened there against this false flag situation. But as I talked earlier, it is a typical tactic of the Indian government. It's been going on since 1947. They literally will stoop to the deepest depths just to do anything to target and smear and destroy and undermine the Sikh community, James.
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't have said it better that, we've been following this for quite some time. And we are honored and grateful that you allow us to bring this to the wider audience and try to be that bridge between communities to raise awareness, Angus.
Absolutely. Now, the final two comments, and James, we had a comment yesterday how our Punjabi, we're now fluent in Punjabi and how well our Punjabi is going. Well, let me demonstrate by reading these two comments. Firstly, from Mastan Singh Dulai, and you'll have to forgive my pronunciation, but it goes something like this. Idana Hidu Garamita 1947, Tom Lai Kehuna, Taka Side Ate Aside Torate 728 Laka Sikam Di Katala Hai. Now, I've absolutely butchered that Punjabi, so my apologies, but basically what that does actually say, and it's actually a very serious comment, it's related to the comment before. The Indian Hindu government has directly and indirectly murdered 7 to 8 lakh Sikhs since 1947, and I dare say that could well be even an underestimate. We do know, James, that the Indian government, through its proxies, whether it's the Punjab police or whether it's the army, they had literally murdered in cold blood tens of thousands of Sikhs across the decades.
Absolutely. And how many suicides or quote suicides were actually at the hands of the government officials or law enforcement within the regions? And, it kind of reminds me of all of the Russian people who opposed Putin that somehow found a way to fall out hotel windows that didn't actually open.
Exactly. And I'm going to leave the last comment to Gurpreet, who says, and again, my Punjabi, which is coming along in leaps and bounds, Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh, Khalistan, Zindabad, Zindabad. And of course, we all know what that means, James. Long live Khalistan.
That's right.
And on that very wonderful and powerful note, we must leave Perspectives for another day. But as always, thanks so much for all your comments. Do keep them coming in. There's been some great comments coming in. Thanks for all your emails as well. Thanks for pointing out some really important news stories. Do keep those coming in. It really does help us, and it's always great to have a chat about them at the end of the show as well. So, but don't forget, you can message us, of course, directly. Send us some photos, as James said at the beginning of the show. Send us any photos you like. We'd be delighted to share them up. But you can send those to message@satlogetv.com. And do keep those emails coming in. Do keep the comments coming in. But in the meantime, that is it for another day. Unfortunately, we must draw things to a close. It is a goodbye from me, a goodbye from James.
Stay safe, everyone.
You have, of course, been watching Perspectives. We will see you next time.